So we have a bunch of questions, and I wanted to know if we could start off something that I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about. You started at the beginning about this rapid urbanization that Texas
Hmm.
experiences, right? And it's really interesting because by 1920, the U.S. population is majority urban for the first time. And we won't get there in the U.S. Census till 1950. But, a third of all Texans are living in, 2,500 or more cities by 1920. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship between this rapid urbanization that Texas is experiencing, kind of like the whole United States has been experiencing
You just
since like the
froze.
century, and this movement towards progressivism. You could like walk that out a little. I
Yes.
freeze?
And I think it's important. Can you hear me okay? Because you're freezing a little bit.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
So one of the things I think in connection to that, you said, Texas won't get there until between the 1940 and 1950 census. But between 1910 and 1920, if you look at the percentage of Texans and where they're living and what's happening, is that urban growth is far surpassing what we're talking about with rural growth, which means people are moving in very large numbers to urban areas, and those urban populations are increasing. And so kind of how that works with all of this is that you have people in each other's spaces all the time, but you also have a lot of consumer goods being produced and purchased and eaten, in particular case, and what I'm talking about with food. And that means that you may not know your local grocer as well. You may not know your local dairy person as well, because there's very many to choose from, and you're possibly living in a large urban area. And with these larger numbers, these larger groups, there's certain things that people are looking for on who can I go purchase for. Is that kind of what you're asking, or you want me to do it in a different way?
No, I think you're on the right track. I just mean that Texas is experiencing this rapid shift. It's the first time in the state's history that urbanization is really reshaping the region, besides Galveston and San Antonio's experiences, in a broad kind of way, right? And so, like, when you think about like the progressives' efforts to bring governance and scientific thinking to reforming all these problems that you've talked about with Corpus Christi and other places like that, I was thinking about like how these oil boom towns, right, that are going all over the place. Like Breckenridge goes from I think 800 people to 33,000 in 1918. Like in 1 year, it's just boom. Oh, there's a town, and so there's a lot of problems that come with that, right?
It is, and it's also a lot of life changes. You have to think about a lot of these individuals were living in rural and urban areas and on farms prior to, and what kinds of things they would have had access to there that they may not have readily access to when they're moving to these cities. And so the lifestyle change with the individuals that are doing that, but also the amount that it's happening. It's not just happening. I mean, Corpus Christi I picked because it's kind of a mid-level. It doesn't even make the top 5. And I purposely did that because it shows how much all over the place we're seeing this kind of urbanization, this kind of change.
Actually. Well, so building on that, we've got a couple of questions I wanted to put in front of you. And so Brady and Taylor asked something very similar in one regard, but I would see if you could, since Brady got the first one in, I'm going to start with that and then follow up with Taylor. But so how would you say historians now would characterize these conservative forces during this period when it's a period of great change, right? But you have the rise of the Klan, which makes its national headquarters in Texas in the 1920s, right? And you have, the oil baron of Standard Oil, with Rockefeller, but the broader sort of like push of the robber barons kind of reign coming to an end in the early 20th century, right? And how is, well, first off, how much do Texans?
I don't know about that, but go ahead.
I'll say, but well, how much do Texans play are tuned into those big arguments and things that are going on, and how have historians seen all that play out from their perspective?
Okay, I think this is a multi-part question, so I'm going to answer a few of the parts, but I'm going to start with this idea of this conservative, the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK is one of the ones that's often brought up in argument with this. And that's why it's very important that I said earlier on at the beginning of the hour or beginning of our whatever session, that progressivism doesn't necessarily mean egalitarianism, equality. It doesn't. The Klan is often considered a progressive organization. It's associational. It has a national organization that has state level affiliates, that has local clubs, and it passes information back and forth, and it does things a certain way according to the norms of that particular organization. And it, horrifically, but in many cases, most cases, it's looking at solving certain things that its members think are a problem. And, it shocks people to hear individuals discuss the 1920s Klan as a progressive era organization. It is. Doesn't mean that it's not highly violent, doesn't mean that it's not highly problematic, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't run through, domestic terrorist type activities in many ways. But it still creates and aligns itself in that progressive era kind of sense. And so, just because the organizations, the associations are, it's a very similar model. And progressives don't agree. All progressives don't agree. I mean, another organization that would be considered a progressive organization would be the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And no one can argue that the KKK and the NAACP see eye to eye on things. So, but they're both progressive organizations. And I did not equate the two, just so I'm making sure everyone knows I said that. That's not my point. As far as other types of conservative forces or other themes that we talk about, so for example, with the introduction of oil, in Texas, you have an enormous introduction of wealth, and very, very quick wealth, industrialized wealth. Doesn't mean that people who are connected to some of this didn't have some sort of wealth before, because they had to have had access to purchase things and do these things. But the level of wealth is just explosive. And that means that money's pouring in, and that means access to influence will often go along with that. And we see a number of governors, lots of legislators coming out of this era who are directly connected to this. And so some of these individuals will have connections with progressive organizations and some won't. But you do see this overlap.
I was gonna say, if I could jump in, that gets to a question that Taylor asked about. So when you think about the new importance of oil in the Texas economy and its influence on the state, and Ida Tarbell and her attack on Rockefeller and all that with Standard Oil, how did oil affect, or how did Texans who were in the progressive era's tumult over politics here, how did they land on those sorts of issues when it came to regulating the big businesses like oil?
So, at least for what I've studied, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but one of the, some of the things that we see is that some of the individuals associated with these oil baron families, for lack of a better word, or these oil wealthy families, are going to really influence the direction of the organizations they're involved in. And so, for example, a number of individuals, I mean, if you all want names, I'll get you some names, but I want you to kind of get the larger theme. A number of women who are involved, who are either the sisters or the wives of a number of these oil wealth families, and these men who are heads of these companies are suffragists. And they're going to be very connected to, pushing this idea of suffrage, but at the same time, they're going to have a lot of influence with their local organizations because just the enormous level of money that they have. And that means also the enormous influence potentially with local and state level office holders. And so with those connections, with those networks, you kind of see it play itself out that way. As far as a response to that, you're going to see a pushback among all sorts of groups, labor, organizations that are arguing that, the rights of workers are not being upheld, and they'll target, or they'll focus, I should say, on certain oil companies or certain industries connected to those oil companies because, for example, ports, and what's going on with ports and longshoremen with those ports, and all these kinds of strikes all are that industrial kind of approach. And so that's one way. Another way is there'll be politicians who will want to see less influence by certain individuals because they want to see more influence by other individuals. And so it kind of plays itself out, but depending on who's being supported by these this oil wealth and who's not. And Ida Tarbell, specifically is using journalism for that. And you see that all over Texas. To get away from the oil a little bit and given a different example of that.
Well, I was going to say, I want to make sure we have time so that people can.
No, you're fine. You're fine. But the Dallas Morning News will do that with the Klan. They're extremely critical of the Klan, and there will be that kind of using journalism for that. And so you kind of see that in the same way.
Right. Exactly. The muckraking tradition goes multiple directions, and that's another powerful example of there's no clean lines here, which I think is a really useful way to think about it. Yeah, exactly.